The eras of the 20th century are best defined by their pop culture. How we dressed, what we watched, and how we danced were all wildly different from one decade to another. And though it may be difficult to believe, the things we considered cool and trendy in the 80s would be looked at with the same bewilderment that we now look at 50s fashion or music. With that said, here's a look back at some of the most iconic trends of each decade since the 1920s, starting with the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s was a time of great change. The Great War had just ended, and women finally got the right to vote in the United States. This era was also known as the Jazz Age, named after the genre of music that emerged during this time. Jazz music originated in African American communities in New Orleans and was characterized by improvisation and syncopation. Some of the most famous jazz musicians of the era include Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith. The fashion of the 1920s was heavily influenced by the flapper movement. Flappers were young, stylish women who rejected the restrictive clothing and social conventions of the Victorian era. They wore short, loose dresses, bobbed their hair, and used makeup to accentuate their eyes and lips. The most iconic accessory of the flapper era was the feather boa, which was a long, flowing scarf made from feathers that could be wrapped around the shoulders or head. Other popular accessories included long pearl necklaces, which symbolized wealth and glamour, and beaded bags, which were small, sparkly, and often carried over the shoulder. The 1930s brought about the Great Depression, but this didn't stop Hollywood from producing some of the greatest movies of all time. Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington were just a few of the classics that defined the decade. During the 1930s, Hollywood became the epicenter of the film industry, and movie stars were treated like royalty. Some of the biggest names of the era include Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, and Judy Garland. Fashion in the 1930s was more formal than the previous decade, but no less glamorous. Women wore tailored suits and dresses with cinched waists and full skirts. Men's fashion was also more refined, with three-piece suits being the standard for formal occasions. But what truly set the 30s apart was the rise of Hollywood style. Movie stars like Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo became known for their unique sense of style, and their looks were copied by women all over the world. The 1940s was a time of war and rationing, but this didn't stop people from expressing themselves through fashion. In fact, during the Second World War, people were encouraged to make do with what they had and get creative with their clothing. Women wore dresses made from ration books, and men's suits were often patched up and reused. Despite the hardships of the era, people still found ways to look stylish and make a statement. One of the most iconic fashion trends of the 1940s was the use of bold colors and patterns. Women wore bright red lipstick and nail polish, and men's suits featured large, showy lapels. Another trend was the use of wide-legged trousers, which were a departure from the slim-fitting pants of the 30s. This was also the era of the zoot suit, a style popular among young African-American men that consisted of a very tight jacket with padded shoulders and very loose, wide-legged trousers. Though the 40s were a time of austerity, people still found ways to express their individuality through their clothing. The 1950s was a time of economic prosperity and social change in America. The baby boom generation was born, and the suburbs began to sprawl. This decade also saw the rise of rock and roll music, which became the soundtrack of a generation. Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll, and his music and dance moves shocked and appalled many Americans. But he was not alone. Other popular artists of the era included Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Fashion in the 50s was all about looking good while keeping it classy. For women, this meant wearing fitted dresses with cinched waists and full skirts. Men wore suits with narrow lapels, and fedoras were still in style. The most iconic accessory of the 50s was the poodle skirt, a full-circle skirt that was decorated with a felt or leather poodle. Other popular trends included saddle shoes, which were a type of shoe that had two different colored soles, and the Homburg hat, a stylish felt hat that was worn by both men and women. The 1960s was a decade of social and political upheaval. The Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War were two of the most defining events of the era. Music reflected the turmoil of the times, with artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez becoming known for their protest songs. The British invasion was also a major part of the 60s music scene, with bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones taking America by storm. Fashion in the 1960s was a reaction against the conservatism of the 50s. For women, this meant embracing new styles like the miniskirt and the shift dress. Men also experimented with new looks, such as the mod style, which featured slim suits and bold geometric patterns. The 60s was also the era of the hippie, a counterculture movement that rejected traditional values and embraced peace, love, and freedom of expression. Hippies typically wore colorful, flowing clothing and jewelry made from natural materials. The 1970s was a decade of self-discovery and experimentation. The sexual revolution and the women's rights movement were two of the most important social movements of the era. Disco music was all the rage, and people danced the night away at clubs like Studio 54, Some of the most popular disco artists of the 70s include the Bee Gees, Donna Summer, and Gloria Gaynor. Fashion in the 1970s was a reflection of the decade's free-spirited vibe. For women, this meant wearing bohemian-style clothing like peasant blouses and bell-bottoms. Men also embraced a more relaxed style of dressing, with leisure suits and platform shoes being popular choices. The 70s was also the era of glam rock, a genre of music that combined the theatricality of theater and the rawness of rock and roll. Glam rock artists like David Bowie and T-Rex were known for their outrageous costumes and makeup. The 1980s was a decade of excess and the fashion was big, the music was loud, and the movies were larger than life. Some of the most iconic movies of the 80s include Raiders of the Lost Ark, Back to the Future, and The Breakfast Club. Music in the 80s was dominated by MTV, with artists like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince becoming superstars. Fashion in the 1980s was all about making a statement. For women, this meant wearing bold colors and patterns, and for men, it meant donning shoulder pads and power suits. The most iconic fashion trend of the 80s was the power suit, a tailored suit that was worn with a strong belt to emphasize the wearer's silhouette. Other popular trends included acid wash jeans, neon workout clothes, and chunky jewelry. The 1990s was a decade of grunge and minimalism. The fashion was more relaxed and casual, with ripped jeans and oversized sweaters being popular choices. Music in the 90s reflected this change in style, with bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam leading the grunge movement. Other popular genres of the 90s include hip-hop and R&B, with artists like Tupac, Notorious B.I.G., and Mariah Carey topping the charts. The most iconic fashion trend of the 1990s was grunge, a style that originated in Seattle and was characterized by flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and combat boots. Other popular trends included oversized everything, slip dresses, and platform shoes. The 90s was also the era of boy bands and girl groups, with Backstreet Boys and Spice Girls dominating the pop music scene. The 2000s was a decade of pop princesses and hip-hop divas. The fashion was a mix of casual and glamorous, with low-rise jeans and crop tops being popular choices. Music in the 2000s was dominated by pop and hip-hop, with artists like Rihanna and Lady Gaga topping the charts. Some of the most iconic fashion trends of the 2000s include low-rise jeans, which were tight-fitting and showed a lot of mid-range, crop tops, which were small and often paired with low-rise jeans, and the little black dress, which was a versatile piece that could be dressed up or down. The 2010s was a decade of social media and celebrity culture. The fashion was fast-paced and ever-changing, with athleisure being a major trend. Music in the 2010s was dominated by pop and electronic dance music, with artists like Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran, and Justin Bieber topping the charts. Some of the most iconic fashion trends of the 2010s include athleisure, which is the combination of athletic and leisure wear; selfie style, which is a fashion trend that takes inspiration from social media posts and the desire to look good in photographs; and normcore, which is a style that rejects the flashy and trendy for the more understated and everyday. And that is why I look back at some of the most iconic trends of each decade since the 1920s. Which decade do you think had the best fashion? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.